I will go straight into introducing Jean. Jean trained as a quantum physicist, as a PhD in quantum physics, and that led her into complexity. It's a natural progression, really, quantum physics to complexity, and the application of that to organizations and social structures. And she has been a management consultant, still has a management consultancy, but also does a lot of lecturing. She's a visiting fellow at the Cranfield School of Management and at the Bristol Business School. She works with the Complex Systems Research Centre at Cranfield, and she also teaches complexity theory on the MSc in, it used to be called the MSc in Responsible Business Practice, and now it's called the something different. Yes. From Bath to Ashridge. This is a group that comes every year and does its ecology module here. Masters in Sustainability and Responsibility, it's now called Ashridge, and she teaches the complexity bit on that. So she is going to talk tonight about complexity and spirituality, particular reference to sort of Eastern spirituality. So that's a topic that I'm really looking forward to hearing about. So she will talk, and then as usual there'll be questions and answers. We'll end at 9:30, and then you're all invited to go to the dining area, carry on discussions over chai and biscuits.
Thanks very much. So, good evening, everybody. It's a bit of a title, isn't it? Complexity and Spirituality and Transformation. So it'll be interesting to see what I say. I'm not an expert in all spiritual traditions. It's something that interests me, and I've certainly thought a lot about. And this interplay of people often position science and spirituality as not speaking to each other, as being different, and that's intrigued me for a long time. And I've convened a group in Bath where I live that's an ongoing group that's been meeting for a few years now, where we keep working with this idea of science and spirituality and to what extent are they the same and to what extent are they different. But this is just my view. It's some of this material I've never talked to anybody about before, so I hope you find it interesting. Some of it, the people who've been here this week will notice a few of the earlier slides they've seen this week. So I'm really going to try and reflect on the connection of the science of complexity and ancient cosmologies. And when I say they're ancient, as somebody pointed out to me this week, it doesn't mean to say they're no longer used. It's just that they were developed a long time ago, 500 BC in many cases. And the real interest, of course, in all of this is so what does it mean we do to change the world? So this isn't, in my mind, just a sort of vague interest. It's a sort of pragmatic issue of what can we learn about? What do we need to do in order to look at transformation? So I see it in those terms. So the starting point, and in a sense, a lot of this talk is going to be about worldviews. And what do I mean by a worldview? I hope somebody who's been on the course this week, somebody who's prepared to answer the question. What is a worldview? An attitude, the way we look at the world. So it's the frame that for us is the way the world works. It's the sense we bring, the lens we bring to an understanding of the way the world works. So can you see some examples of what are those images suggesting about a world view? Does anybody want to speak to any of them? So this one's particularly about everything's woven together and connected, isn't it? What about this one in the middle? Mechanic. It's a machine. It's got lots of bits that link together in a way that's fixed. So these are images that underpin various aspects of worldviews. And I suppose my next question is, why does it matter? Does it really matter? We live in a very, one way of saying that discourse is, well, it doesn't really matter. Everybody's view is equally valid, and there's no right answer. Is one kind of way that's conceived of. But why do you think I think it matters how we design? How do we?
Well, if you think of the world universe as a mechanistic concept, then you're going to have particular attitudes.
Yeah.
In relation to that.
Yes. So if you think the world's mechanical, you're going to try and control it because you believe it's controllable, sort of thing. So I think this is really very important, and I think as I see this as my contribution to transformation. This is something that I feel quite passionately about, and I want to talk to people about ways of understanding, unpicking our worldviews, which we don't even know sometimes, do we? We think what we think is just normal or true. We don't necessarily unpick the way we look at the world. So to start off with ancient cosmologies, I'm in the middle of writing a book. Mind you, I seem to have been in the middle of writing a book for rather longer than I'd like to admit. Some people I know write them rather quicker. But in this book, which is about embracing complexity, I went back and I was interested in, well, has complexity theory invented ideas? Or, what were people thinking about a long time ago? And so this is a collection of bits and pieces from some very early, the pre-Socratic in the West, the people before Plato. Don't ask me why they call it pre-Socratic, because it's mainly about pre-Plato. But there you go, it's not my fault. And so Heraclitus, what does Heraclitus say? You never step in the same river twice. And actually, he didn't. He said that. That's the fragment. But that's what it means. So Heraclitus's idea was you never step in the same river twice. Things change. Things flow on. You can't capture a past moment. Everything's in flow. Was that pre-Socratic view. This was the view that came after, in a sense, the early ways of trying to make sense of the world, which is if we give a sacrifice to this god or this tree, it'll make it safe. We've got to worry about being the spirits in a rather more in the sense of trying to make peace with the universe because it's a frightening place. After that period, the first thinkers who were trying to kind of shape and understand the world came up with these ideas, and from a Hindu tradition, the same sort of period as this Greek one. It's almost the same, isn't it? These rivers flow, they arise from the sea and flow into the sea. These rivers, while they're in the sea, do not know I am this river and I am that river. So it's an image of flow, it's an image of coming together. It doesn't matter. In the end, it doesn't matter. Is it you? Is it me? Who did it? Who's here? When we're together, does it matter where I came from? It's a beautiful image. And I was lucky enough to hear the Dalai Lama speak a couple of years ago in the most amazing, in a sense, context. It was in this huge venue in Nottingham where they do the X Factor. That, for those people, so they have sort of take that, the X Factor, the Dalai Lama. It's quite amusing. So this enormous stadium with this enormous Tibetan temple at the front, and hundreds of monks chanting, and it was 3 days of the Dalai Lama speaking with a translator. So you didn't get the superficial view. You got this just wonderful, working through texts and really, chewing over what it meant. And I was completely flabbergasted when he said, and this was taped and then I wrote it down, but this phrase about emptiness, he described this Buddhist meaning of emptiness in this most elegantly beautiful way. That's reminding us that things have form, but that form can flow and change into another form. That even what we are, even who I am, is much more changeable than I'd like to think. If you don't believe me, come and work in Schumacher. I find my moods and how I feel about things is like, oh, it's half an hour later now and I feel like this. You can get me in a serene moment and you can get me in an agitated moment, and it's very context dependent. It flows, and then I think, oh, what was all the fuss about? I'm fine now, and I'm off over here. So it's a reminder that I'm much more empty than I'd like to pretend I am. I'm not a fixed person. What you see and how I experience myself is flowing and changing. The same for structures. So that could have been, as I'll move on to, complexity theory. Absolutely beautiful. I wanted to go and hug him. It was just so beautifully said. And then the same with Taoism. And what the Taoist quote is including is this idea, which was very uncomfortable for us, but the door isn't always open. You know, it's a sort of synchronicity idea. Sometimes change can happen, and sometimes it can't. Sometimes opportunities go. You know, sometimes climate change is taken off and it's too late. At some point it will be too late. Sometime for the dinosaurs, it got too late. You know, it isn't an incremental world where if you don't like it, you pull back a bit. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't change very easily. Sometimes change flows. So it's also an image not just of a constantly available, incremental, linear, you know, easily controllable world. It's a lumpy world in that sense. It's got form. And I could go on. There's some more that are in the same. Marcus Aurelius, a bit 100 AD, I think that was. Julius Caesar seems to have crept in. Shakespeare, which is obviously a little bit later. But the same kind of flow. So they were the images. That was the wisdom that people had in 500 BC about the way the world worked. So we then contrast this with the mechanical worldview that you were just talking about the fact that for most traditional organisational methods, for most economic methods, for most of the methods we use to run the education system, particularly in this country and increasingly in this country, sadly, we treat it as if it's a machine. So our approach increasingly to education is, you know, we're not doing terribly well. So, hey, I know what I'll do. You're a teacher. I'll tell you exactly what to teach. I'll tell you how to teach it. I'll tell you when to teach it. I'll measure whether you've taught it. I'll measure the pupils, whether they've taught it, and that'll get better. Meanwhile, we are doing worst in Europe in terms of our educational standards. We have the most teenage pregnancies. We have the lowest literacy rates. We have the fewest people going into science. Every educational measure in Europe, we are almost the bottom of. But hey, we've got more infrastructure than you could possibly imagine. When I went to school, you had a school secretary and a bursar, and they spent most of the time cuddling you and putting plasters on your knees when you fell over. And if it was a nice day, you went and sat under a tree. And it was intrinsically more person-centred or pupil-centred because they didn't know any better. They just thought that was what they were supposed to do. So it was context-dependent. But we've turned it into a mechanical system, and then wonder why it doesn't work. So that's my impassioned speech about education. But it's the same in business. The voluntary sector is completely frustrated by the fact that everything is about measurement. So you can say, on the other hand, well, you know, come on, Jean, you can't not measure things because it wouldn't be fair. So I would answer, well, yes, you need to measure things, but you need to make sure you get the right kind of qualitative measures that are generative and take you into the right behaviours. If you just measure bums on seats because that's what you can easily measure, you may not get what you're actually trying to achieve. So we've become a measurement mad, mechanically mad society in many ways. And people are frightened that if they don't measure or if they don't justify this, or that somehow they'll be accused of being unfair or something like that. So it's a hugely strong worldview that dominates our world and sadly increasingly dominates our world. And that's another way of describing that worldview, is that we kind of know it's not true. And with the group this week I've been working it, we did a little exercise of, you know, think back to when you were 16, has your life gone to plan? And of course, you know, the answer is no, but then you never thought it would. You know, well, why did you never think the life would go to plan? Well, I never had a plan. You know, the world changed irreversibly. I changed. We don't expect our life to go to plan. It's a stupid question, which is why I ask it. But when it comes to our organisational world, we sort of go, oh, well, we've at least got to pretend it goes to plan. If you talk to anybody in an organisation, they say, I've got to fill in these forms, you know, I've got to do this budgeting, and it's a game. But that's what we ask people to do. So the interesting question then is why? You know, where did this come from? You know, the Taoists and the Buddhists weren't bothered by all this, you know, mechanical worldview malarkey. So where did it all come from? So the real culprit was Plato. He was the first culprit of this. And apparently, in the research I've done for looking at this, it was really Plato who said, I don't believe that form emerges. I don't believe you could have structures in the world that just emerge. There must have been a creator. And he introduced the idea of a creator. And of course, if you have a creator, you have a beginning. And then this idea of perfect forms. So the ideal forms that sit somewhere else, it's not entirely clear where they sit, but that was Plato's view, that there is perfection, and that the earth is trying to be perfect. So any messiness or variety or diversity is an irritation of life, but we must smooth it out and become perfect. So it's an image of progress towards perfection. It's an image of a beginning, and it's an image of a creator. So it cut right across the kind of Western tradition that had come from Heraclitus and other pre-Socratics. In a way, this was added to it by Aristotle. I read a very interesting paper about the difference between Aristotle's views of man versus animals and Mencius's views. Mencius was a Confucian philosopher, and his views of man and the animals. So Aristotle said the difference between man and animal is that man can reason and animals can't. Oh, and by the way, women are a bit dodgy. So it's so men have reason, women have emotion, and then there's animals who have instincts. And that has been a very powerful image. What's very interesting, using complexity theory to talk about that, is the path dependency. When you get a very strong image in a culture that serves certain reasons and understandings, it can be very difficult to shift. Things sustain. So that's that image of, man has reason. The word, as you know, the word hyster is the Greek for womb, and of course it's women who are hysterical and men who have reason, and then animals who have merely have instincts, in which case they haven't met my dog, who's very good at reasoning, when he's going to get fed, what I'm about to do next, whether I'm going to leave him in the kitchen or take him with me. That seems to me he's reasoning, he's following he's learned the patterns of my behaviour. Mencius in the East said he had this word zin, which is not just his word. It is I think it's a Chinese word, which means heart mind. And what he said is that the difference between animals and man, if there is one, is zin. It's issues of heart mind. It's issues of compassion. It's issues of suffering. It's issues of the imagination. So he may be wrong. I'm not saying this is necessarily right, but he was saying the mixture of, in order to feel compassion, I've got to imagine what might be happening to you, and that's a mixture of my heart and my mind. In order to really worry about the suffering in another country, I've got to think about it. I've got to imagine it. I've got to connect with it, and that it was that integration of heart mind which is so central to the way man works. So that had a very strong, Plato had a very strong contribution. And many centuries later, along comes Isaac Newton, who did, at the time, made the most incredible step forward. It was a very, very simple step. What he did by making very simplifying assumptions, he was able to understand the way a planet went round the sun. And I mean, I'm not knocking it at all. It was a huge step forward to understand this inverse square law, how gravity works, and he was able to predict how the Earth went round the sun. And his very simplifying assumptions was that he ignored. I think it's got upset.
Oh, I just moved my chair.
Oh.
It's gone green now. So.
Sorry, John.
That's okay. Is it coming on? Oh, it is, yes. So. Sorry, I must have upset Plato. So sorry, Plato. Or was it Newton? Is it? Yeah, so.
The law of mechanics is about that.
Yes, exactly. Oh, it's gone on my... Just go back one slide. So the physics that in one sense was a huge step forward because it allowed you to understand more or less the way the planets went round each other. It allowed you to understand the way billiard balls knock into each other. But the really interesting thing about Newton's physics, and I think he would have been a bit taken aback by it in some ways, was it was about planets and billiard balls, but it wasn't a theory of everything. It was about planets and billiard balls. So, why did we make it into a theory of everything? Why did we think it underpinned everything? The culprit in this case, this was very, very interesting. I was telling the group earlier. This is a very interesting story. Anybody know anything about the Marquise de Châtelet? Apart from the people I told about this earlier in. Anybody else heard of the Marquise de Châtelet? Well, the Marquise de Châtelet, Voltaire was her lover, okay, not the other way around. So she was the mathematician, the Marquise de Châtelet, this well-known woman that nobody's heard of. She translated Newton's Principia into French from Latin and understood the maths. So she was obviously no slouch. And then she and Voltaire worked on introducing that through this book, Elements of the Philosophy of Newton. And it really was taken up by the French Enlightenment, not by the Scottish Enlightenment, but the French Enlightenment, who were looking for a new image. And what it allowed them to think about was, we can design the world, we can design a new society. This is telling us that you can use reason to design things, it's predictable, we can have a whole new society that we can design and it will be perfect. So it was a very strong, it had a very strong impact that we still live in this modernist Enlightenment world still. This is still the dominant paradigm. So that was kind of how it happened, that it was, they understood, they got intrigued by this piece of physics. But there's another really interesting part to this story, and I'll just take a little bit of time to kind of go into this a little bit. In order for the physics to work, if I'm doing a simple mechanical problem, say I had two billiard balls that were going to knock into each other on this floor here. In order to cope with the maths of it, I need to have a frame of reference. So that's easy. I can say, well, relative to this room, I'll make this point 0 and I'll measure it up to there, and I'll have this as left and this as right. So I can use this as a frame of reference. And then I can do my maths. So if you want to turn this into a theory of everything, then you say it applies to the universe. Okay. So how do you have a frame of reference outside the universe? It sort of doesn't make sense, does it? Because if the universe is the universe, what's outside the universe that allows you to orientate the universe? How do you, if you want to say this is the left of the universe and this is the right of the universe, then, or this is the middle of the universe, it has to be relative to something. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So it kind of doesn't work, and Newton needed what in science is called an axiom. He needed to assume that there was a frame of reference sitting somewhere, outside the universe in order for it to work. And there was a very interesting correspondence, which I've got a book of it, where somebody called Clarke, who was one of Newton's colleagues, had this correspondence with Leibniz, because Leibniz didn't like the sound of this. And so Leibniz wrote to Newton and said, this doesn't make sense. There isn't, how can you have a time 0 and an orientation? How can you have this frame of reference? So Newton said, because it's God's will. If God wills it, it can be so. And Leibniz said, well, that's stupid, because any reasonable God, why would he set off the universe now rather than half an hour earlier or later? So it doesn't really, why would God decide this is the left-hand side and this is the right-hand side? And Newton said, well, God wills it. So there were a number of challenges to Newton's ideas as a philosophy of everything. Leibniz pointed out the rather obvious point that the universe is full of structure. The planets are all different sizes, they have different characteristics, the clusters, there's the galaxies here, there's the Milky Way there, there's this, that and the other. Newton's theory has nothing to say, and has nothing to offer the fact that there is a structure to the universe. so isn't that interesting? So something that's as fundamental as the universe is full of structure, Newton's physics has nothing to offer. So in Newton's Optics, which was another of the big books, and it's all on the internet, you can look at it, in some of the appendices to Newton's Optics, there are bits in there where somebody would say to Newton, why is the solar system flat? And Newton apparently said, because God periodically pats it back into place. So what... This isn't at this moment in time a discussion about whether God is or isn't and could or couldn't. But the point is, the most rational of sciences, the thing we hold up as the scientific method, linear cause and effect, the way we do all other sciences, physics have kind of given up on it, but every other science, isolate the problem, measure the relationship between this and this. It's all based on whether God periodically plats the solar system back into place. So the axioms on which things are determined, if you don't look at it, you can get terribly beguiled. So science is a story. This is a story that fits certain situations. I'm not knocking it. It's been the start of, an awful lot of developments, this simple mechanical science. But when you start to apply it as a theory of everything, it gets a bit dodgy if you've got to have God patting things back into place periodically. So Smolin, who's a cosmologist, a physicist, said, the fact that we live in a universe with structures at so many scales is so commonplace, so manifest, that it's easy to miss its significance. So in other words, if you've got a physics that says nothing about it, has nothing to say about it, well, it's a bit peculiar, isn't it? But we somehow haven't noticed. So moving on then, there are obviously many things that I could talk about, but the other the two things that have probably had the most impact on Western thought is Newton and Darwin. But I want to just talk a little bit about the pre-Darwinian era. So a long time before Charles Darwin entered the frame, people knew about the fossil records. So they'd already got the bit that, they hadn't got all the bits, but they'd sort of worked out that some animals and plants came before other animals and plants. So they'd got that bit. They knew that there was a fossil record. It wasn't that Darwin discovered. And they knew that some things were older than other things. So that you can find diagrams of, starting with amoeba and moving on to apes and that kind of thing. They'd sort of got all that. But it was understood, the meaning that it was given was of going somewhere. So it was seen as a progress model. So what if you read that was Charles Darwin's grandfather said that, but there were other people at the same time writing about these ideas. So the way they understood evolution was that God had planned it, that you started with simple animals, and then you went on to better animals, and then even better animals, and then even better animals, and then eventually man. So man was the pinnacle of the evolutionary process. And after man, there were the angels and then God. And it was a great chain of being that God had created, with a purpose that started here and went to there. And it was planned. So you can see it's still kind of Newtonian, and it's still got God in. And it's about going somewhere. It's about predictability and progress, and a beginning and an end. So those are very definite constructs in this understanding of evolution. And I think it was Lamarck who was kind of a little bit worried about this and kind of said, if this was God's plan, it's a bit wasteful. Meaning that 90% of species have been destroyed. I think it's probably even more, isn't it? It's or 95% or 99%. Most species get destroyed. It's only a few that survive. So if this is God's plan, it's a bit, it takes an awful lot of excursions, and it's a bit wasteful. So they were kind of worried about it. But this fits with a Judeo-Christian worldview, really, which of course Newton was sitting within as well. So then we had Darwin, and as some of you know better than I do, Darwin was very uncomfortable with with his interpretation, his understanding of how evolution worked, the mechanism of evolution, because he saw it as kind of anti-Christian. It didn't fit with this conventional wisdom, and he angsted for many, many years about this, and didn't publish for many years until Wallace, was it Wallace, who came to the same sort of conclusions, and he realised he was going to have to publish The Origin of Species, or he was going to miss the boat. But Darwin's really significant contribution was the idea that messiness, variation, diversity was part of the mechanism for evolution. That you don't have evolution, you don't have adaptability without messiness. That it's the messiness that allows this variation of an animal to fit better than this one that hadn't adapted. And it's a kind of ecological evolution, the variation changes ecologies, and then do those ecologies, are they well adapted to the prevailing circumstances? So it was hugely significant that even the pre-Socratics, they knew things were messy. They said there is flow, and I don't know whether it's this river or that river, but they didn't see variation as generative. Do you see what I mean? They knew it was there, but they didn't say, wow, this is absolutely fundamental to the way the universe works. So this was huge. And what's fascinating, if you've nothing better to do like me than to read loads of books all the time, is how it's utterly significant that was in the late 19th century to everything, to philosophy, to literature, to science, to psychology, to anthropology. Everybody was completely entranced by this idea of indeterminism, of variation. And what he also was including is the emergence, obviously, of new form, and the fact that the future emerges and cannot be known in advance. So that was hugely different. Hopefully it reminds you of those pre-Socratic, those early traditions of Buddhism and Taoism and Heraclitus. It's much more similar to that sort of idea, but it caused him huge personal pain. This is just an example of William James, who you may have heard of. Henry James is... hello? Somebody looking at us? Who is Henry James's brother, who got really entranced by this issue of indeterminism. Where are you going to go? You're going to hide there. Who really became entranced by indeterminism, and was saying, well, if we did have determinism, if it was all beautifully planned, the future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb. They did write beautifully. I wish I could write things like that. The part we call the present is compatible with only one totality. So they were starting to grapple with the fact, well, if it was all predicted, there's just, there's nothing, is there? We're just kind of on this path. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says the parts have a certain amount of loose play on one another. It admits that possibilities may be in excess of actualities, and that things not yet revealed to our knowledge may really in themselves be ambiguous. Of two alternative futures which we conceive, both may now really be possible, and the one becomes impossible only at the very moment when the other excludes it by becoming real itself. Now that was marvellous. That was nothing to do with maths or, science at this stage. That's a philosopher just thinking about the implications of indeterminism and triggered by Darwin. So I think that's absolutely wonderful stuff. And D.H. Lawrence, I got this from Jean, you'll recognise this. D.H. Lawrence, he was one of the, he was writing at the turn of the century, and he's kind of, people who were authors were quite entranced by Darwin. So we know that even God could not imagine the redness of a red geranium, nor the smell of mignonette when the geraniums were not, nor the mignonette neither. So he's using this idea that things are not knowable in advance. They're not just automatically going to happen. So I think that's it's very interesting. So I'm moving on to the subject that has entranced me for many, many years, this science of complexity theory. And I found it extremely stimulating because it turns its head on, ideas of what science is, in the way that evolution, in a way, is a very different sort of science than this mechanical science. In the same way, complexity, which came from physics, in a similar way, has completely kind of changed the image, the story of what science is like. And so this has been something that has hugely interested me for an awfully long time. I'm just going to speed up a little bit now. So science, we've talked about the mechanical story. The other story that science has is the one that's called equilibrium thermodynamics. You might have heard of the word entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. And it basically says houses don't reconstruct themselves out of ashes. Houses fall down, people get older, things decay. So that things in the main, the universe is decaying. It's over time, stars blow up, they become dust again. That's the way things go. And I can remember as a student kind of vaguely grappling with this and saying, well, I can't quite get this because one science story tells me that everything is predictable and stays the same. And the other science story tells me everything decays and goes to nothing. So, how do those two fit together? Oh, well, never mind, it's tea time. So I remember having that thought a long time ago. But Ilya Prigogine, who's I'm always rude about Belgian people, but there is a Belgian person here. But he's one of the very few famous Belgians. You now have to name all the other famous Belgians. So there's Tintin, yes, Poirot,
Lemaitre, Big Bang Theory.
Oh, right, Lemaitre, Belgian. Saxophone.
Ballet,
Yes, so
Marguerite.
yes, Marguerite. So. Thank you. That'll teach me. So Prigogine writes about the fact that as a young man, he read a book by Henri Bergson, written in 1907, called Creative Evolution, where Bergson was saying, why is it then that physics tells us that things decay, but matter mounts life mounts the incline that matter descends? Yes. So matter decays, but life ascends. Well, that's why is that? That doesn't make sense. So we've got two images of physics. One that says everything's predictable and stays the same. The other one says, hello.
Are we saving questions for later, or if we have questions?
You can ask a little question now, and then
Wait to the end.
Oh, okay then. So why do we have these two images of physics? And then we have this evolution that seems to be getting into more complicated forms. So Prigogine says that was his inquiry question. He didn't quite use those words, but as a young man, that kind of stuck in his head. And he carried that. He was still writing about that in his 80s. He carried that question around. It drove his life. And the answer to the question for which he got the Nobel Prize is that for open systems, the maths, you can't, the physics is very difficult to do. The maths is very difficult to do for open systems. So you do everything for closed systems. So if you have a closed mechanical system, then it goes on forever. And if you have a closed entropic system with lots of bits in it, then it decays. But if you have an open system that can take in energy and information and react to its environment, it actually combines aspects of thermodynamics and aspects of a system view, and you find that structure can emerge. So that was kind of amazing. So with one word, open, Prigogine was able to connect evolution, mechanical systems, and equilibrium thermodynamics, which was just an incredible kind of an important move forward. This is an example of because he was born in Russia and obviously spoke Russian. A lot of the early physical chemist work that was relevant to this was actually being done in Russia, and he was able to read it, obviously, in the Russian before it was ever translated into English. And so some of this practical work was showing how in certain sorts of open systems you get patterns forming on liquids that have have a scale much greater than the molecular scale. And it's like, well, where do they come from? And it's this part of this being energy being pumped into it from the outside world, which is actually allowing this spontaneous emergence of structure, which is a bit like the spontaneous emergence of patterning in ecologies. So it was kind of linking together. So this was the start of complexity science, and also he also pointed out the role of fluctuations in this, the role of variety. So it was very much like evolution. It needed variety. Those people who've been with me this week, I keep banging on, don't I, about you have to have variation, you have to have diversity, or it doesn't work, which is a very different view than a mechanical view, where you don't need to worry about those kind of things. So this was the complexity view, and in a nutshell, it's saying. And this would take, if you want to do a week's course on it, let me know. But this is the potted version. Most things of interest are systemic, relational, collective. So we're looking at it in relationship. I didn't put that word in after Satish said it last night, by the way. It was already in. So Satish was talking about things being relational, not systemic. I have both words. The importance of diversity, the fact that each situation is different. You can't just say, we now have a method for changing the health service, so we'll put each hospital through the same process and it'll work. It's talking much more about the fact that every family is different. If you try to, you can give people advice about how to bring up their children, but every family is different, every child is different, every school is different. It's emphasising that particularity. The future is unknowable in principle. Even God couldn't know what's happening next. But that's not to say it's just random. There are moments like the door opening where different pathways may emerge, and like William James was saying, there can sometimes be two possibilities up to the point where you take one and then the other possibility in a sense disappears. So does that not remind you of the kind of ancient cosmologies? Does it have the same kind of characteristics? And what I think is so exciting about this is that if you want to use it politically, this is a scientific way of wobbling, getting people to think about worldviews, where they can't say, oh, don't talk to me about Buddhism, dear. I'm a scientist or I'm a politician. I'm not interested in your ideas about ancient, religions. But if I say science says this, then it's harder to ignore me. So it's a very powerful political weapon to actually use this story, providing we don't get too hung up on, is it exactly right? Do you see what I mean? It's a very useful story to use. And I think in some ways this is how I understand complexity theory. If you look at those waves, those shapes of those waves, what's made the wave the shape it is? So what makes the wave the shape it is? The seabed, the wind, lots of variables. Yeah, spoken as a true physicist. Yeah. And also the history, that water in that wave has come from a long way away, so maybe it was a whale, that spouted, 100 miles away that created some disturbance, which, maybe that's part of what's happening. Maybe that wave is made partly up of water that was fairly close to it, that's moved there quickly on the surface, and then water that was further away, I'm getting this wrong way around, but water that was further away that's moved quickly, and water that was closer that's lower down and has moved more slowly and then pops up. Do you see what I mean? So there's a sort of history and a path in that wave. And it has a form. You wouldn't say it didn't have a form, but you can see it won't last forever. And then the kind of the murmur of that form will also remain. There'll be a kind of, what's the word? A sort of shadow. What's the word? Somebody when a form kind of has a memory. There's almost like the memory of the form will still be there to some extent. So that's, I think, the kind of image. And just quickly, it's quite interesting that this Smolin, who I'm a bit keen on this physicist called Smolin, actually has started to wonder whether actually the whole of the universe is an evolutionary process, not just life on Earth. And he's written a wonderful book about this, where he's sort of saying things like, you know, the gravitational constant is some peculiar number. You know, it's, I don't know what it is, but it's a peculiar number. Why is it that number, not any other number? You know, why is gravity, as opposed to what is gravity? You know, the physicists have no answer to the why question. Well, maybe it just emerged because it worked. You know, how many Big Bangs have we had? You know, how many goes has the universe had? This one's kind of worked in some sense. It exists, but maybe the laws of physics emerged. There's nothing sacrosanct about the laws of physics. They work. Do you see what I mean? So it's a kind of if you say evolution is the universal principle of everything, it puts mechanical physics in a different place, doesn't it? It's an interesting to conjure with. Okay, so if I say then, what does complexity theory imply for spirituality? It places no attention on the notion of the beginning or end. It places attention on becoming, like Buddhism and Taoism. It's not really into beginnings and ends. So it doesn't fit with Plato's idea of a creator in some sense. So you can have a metaphysical argument about beginnings and ends, but it's not where it's placing attention. As a spirituality, then it would see it as something that was immanent and co-created rather than up there and outside. It emphasises collective karma, if I can use that word. So there is a collective sense of that what happens here has an impact later. It's just not a kind of clear cause and effect chains. It's not about, you know, exactly what you did causes what happens to me even. What happens to me will be a mixture of what I did, the family I've been brought up in, the culture I'm in, where I am. It's the whole lot, you know, but it's a collective kind of karmic view of how things happen. So I've thought about this a lot, and I think I see very little difference really between how you might understand a spiritual view from complexity and what Buddhism says. I don't see, you know, there may be some subtle differences, but when I hear the Dalai Lama, he could have written a book on complexity theory as far as I can see. So what does it mean then? And this is my view. If I saw complexity theory as a sort of spiritual, if I took it as telling me something about the nature of everything, so it's empowering because it might be me or our actions or values that tip the balance or are the grit in the oyster. It might just be something I say that really impacts on you, and maybe you have lots of influence, and maybe it's part of a change. Maybe it's what you say to me. Quite often, I'm sure, you know, people who've taught or lectured or know people, ever so often somebody, you know, I've had it happen a couple of times where people come up to me and say, you might not remember me, but you 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you said this and I've never forgotten it. And of course, I can't remember them. I can't remember saying it, and I don't agree with it anymore, or whatever it was I said. But it changed them. You know, so you don't know really. All you can do is act in accordance with your own values and be prepared to to review those values. But I can't really know what I'm doing most of the time. It places a focus on relationship with everything rather than just on me as an individual. It suggests that I should pay attention to all that I am. So it's not an enthronement of reason. It's do you think I scared him off? Yes. Oh, right. So there's no focus on reason in this. It's about, you know, how do I act? You know, what am I? It implies responsibility. It makes me a co-creator of my future, but not even a creator of my own future, a co-creator of our future. It allows for agency, but not for complete individual. You know, I can't make my life what I want it to be. All I can do in the Buddhist sense is worrying about the next moment and how I'm acting in that moment. That is all I can do. And Kaufman, Stuart Kaufman, who's I don't know whether he's Canadian or American. Somebody know? He works in Canada now. Anyway, he's written a book on complexity and spirituality, and what he's saying is it more astonishing that a God created all that exists, or that the natural processes of the creative universe have yielded galaxies, chemistry, life, agency, meaning, value, consciousness, culture? In my mind and heart, the overwhelming answer is that the truth, best as we know it, is all that arose with no creator agent, all on its wondrous own. So do you see what I mean? It doesn't need. You can still see it as a spirituality. I just want to go to, where have I put it? Oh, I can't do it. I can't find it. I've lost the bit I wanted to show you. So for me, then, complexity thinking at the level of philosophy worldview. So this isn't getting caught up in Buddhist practice, whether people, what people do, whether they eat meat or something. I'm not looking at the tools of Buddhism. I'm looking at it as a worldview. I see very little to distinguish complexity thinking from Buddhism and Taoism. So Joanna Macy, that some of you will have heard of, who's wrote a PhD on Buddhism and complexity theory, so not surprisingly reached the same conclusion. And if you look on her website, you'll see she said this: I've been deeply inspired by the Buddha's teaching of dependent co-arising. This is, in a way, this is what I've called emptiness. It fills me with a sense of connection and mutual responsibility with all beings, helping to understand the non-hierarchical and self-organisation nature of life. So you can see it's a kind of mixture of Buddhism and the language of complexity. And then she starts to go on to see how, this is a political act. So that means that everything we do impinges on all beings. The way you are with your child is a political act, and the products you buy and your efforts to recycle are part of it too. So is meditation, etc., etc. So I find that very inspiring. I've also got very interested in, I've discovered, some of you will have heard of him, a Buddhist writer called David Loy, who's part of a tradition of engaged Buddhism. And I think he writes absolutely beautifully about Buddhism. And it's very much about, he actually kind of says, if the Buddha were alive today, how would the Buddha make sense of our social practice? So he's written a book called Buddhism and Social Practice, or Social Theory. And so he's not getting caught up in the form of, whether you're supposed to prostrate yourself or the bits that are just form of ritual. He's talking about the ideas. What would it be like if the Buddha had to engage with our social world and natural world? For those of us who see the necessity of radical change, the first implication of Buddhist social praxis is the obvious need to work on ourselves as well as the social system. So there's this emphasis of the inner and the outer. So what I've taken from thinking about this, so my question to myself, this is purely personal, is so what do I take from all this? What should I be doing then? What does this tell me to do? And the first is to do with the balance between the inner and the outer, that how I am in the world, what I can do in the world it necessitates me to reflect and work on myself, to meditate, to reflect, to see that, that's a constant practice, that my inner practice has got to be there all the time with my outer practice. As you would all know here, that's absolutely fundamental to what's done here. I'll come back to the second one. The future is shaped by our collective actions, but we cannot know what will result. So we have to act lightly with humility. We can have intentions, and then we've got to say, but is it working? Am I wrong? Am I right? Do I need to modify this? So, are we collectively getting somewhere? Or so it forces us not to plan all the time, but to try things out, to have intentions to try things out, to do some planning, but to deal with it lightly, not to be destroyed if it doesn't work, but to keep saying, well, what is working? How do we build on that? Why isn't that working? What have we left out? So it's a sort of it's action with humility. And it's also in a more political sense. It's about helping policymakers to understand the reasons why policies must be interconnected, policies must be thought of. We can't have an economic policy and an environmental policy and a social policy because they all compete. You know, it's an obvious point, but how do we? That is an important practice to try and work in that way to get people to understand the implications and the reasons for connect. I just want to go back to this because this was David Lloyd's written about a lot, and I've been following a kind of train of thought about this. It's something he calls the loss of a transcendental canopy. What he's saying is that we, as we become more secularized, people don't have the security, the psychological security that as a society we've had for an awfully long time, that God is there and it's okay, that there's a transcendental canopy of meaning that says, well, I'll do my best, but it's okay, I'm going to heaven, God knows what he's doing, you know, I'll do my best and that's okay. As the world gets more secularized, it's a bit like the loss of the father. If you don't believe that anymore, then you're kind of left, both individually and in society, without that home. It isn't as safe anymore. You have to grow up a bit earlier, and you're not quite sure, you know, where you are and where you're going. And Loy and others have really see this as a very significant issue in the issue of radical change. So Loy quotes Becker, who's saying that, you know, without this transcendental sacred canopy that makes us feel safe, arises a cultural malaise or anomie on the one hand, and a frantic meaning-grabbing compulsiveness on the other, as the cultural immortality ideologies no longer function to keep mortality anxiety at bay. You know, so we're not quite sure, you know, we're going to heaven anymore. It all gets a bit more serious. And this idea that, you know, the addiction to consumerism is the new God, you know, is a way of coping with this loss of the sacred canopy. And I was lucky enough to hear Clive Hamilton, who is a philosopher, Australian guy, who we had a video link at a conference that I attended. And he was really very, very interesting. And he's written a book called Requiem for a Species. And this idea, you know, that the Earth's resources are infinite and humans have a right to exploit them is part of that trend. You know, if God is here, you know, if God gave us the Earth, you know, for us, and then we're going to heaven, we have a very different attitude towards the Earth, if that's what we believe. And he talked very movingly and interestingly about climate change denial, and talked about how strong, particularly in the States, the climate change denial lobby is, how much money it's got, how powerful it is, you know, how political it is, how ruthless it is. And what he was saying is that what he believes is that the reason deniers are so outraged at the message of climate change is it in a sense attacks everything that they are. So it says, your lifestyle is bad, you've caused this. If I take on climate change, then you're bad, democracy's bad because it's got us here, and by the way, God is bad because he hasn't stopped it happening. So it's a hugely emotive issue. And for those people who were here today, we were talking about the transition into a new way of thinking is often affected by denial and strong feelings. So, you know, if you don't want to go through that, it's easier to deny climate change. And what he was saying is the facts aren't really very much to do with it. You can't convince people with facts. You've actually got to try and work with people as a transformation of worldview, which is why, I'm just going to cough. Which is why I'm so passionate about the need to look at worldview. I thought this was extremely interesting. So that was just one thing I just wanted to drop in. This is part of my personal journey. I'm now taking you into the little things that are interesting me at the moment. Bateson said, this is another way of saying the same thing, if you put God outside and set him vis-a-vis his creation, and if you have the idea that you were created in his image, you will logically and naturally see yourself as outside and against the things around you. And as you arrogate all mind to yourself, you will see the world around you as mindless and therefore as not entitled to moral or ethical consideration. So again, it's the worldview thing, again, that drives what we do. Okay, I'm getting near the end. So I just wanted to share with you something that I have is very personal, and I feel slightly embarrassed at the fact I'm about to share this to you. But for reasons I'll explain, I sort of felt that it was the right thing to do. But I'm really interested in this idea of the inner and outer that Buddhism takes you into, and the other tradition that takes you very much. The other person who got incredibly interested in the inner and the outer was Carl Jung. He looked at the I Ching, he looked at alchemy, he developed this idea of synchronicity. Actually, with Pauli, who is a quantum physicist, he actually interpreted over 300 of his dreams, and there's a marvellous correspondence on synchronicity between Pauli and Jung. Which is just really, really worth reading. If you're mad like me and like to do things like that, it's very, very interesting. And Marie-Louise von Franz was a woman. He started working with her when she was quite young, and she became his student and worked with him all her life. And there were some absolutely. She was taped in 1980 something. There's something like 12 hours of tapes of her being interviewed, and there were only 1,000 copies made of these tapes. And I was lucky enough somebody I knew somebody who had them, and we had a weekend of actually watching these tapes, and it was absolutely fascinating because Marie-Louise von Franz is a very kind of thinking type. She's a thinking type, intellectual woman. She's very, very rigorous. She's not in any way woolly, but yet she's driving that attention onto dreams and alchemy. So it's very interesting to hear her because she's so precise and intellectually rigorous, and yet she's looking at this nebulous thing called dreams. And I found it really changed me this weekend listening to her. And what she was keen to explain was that amongst other things in this weekend on these tapes, was that the central tenet of the alchemist is that the collective inner world is at one with the outer world. That was his whole interest. It was how the inner and the outer, in some sense, are mirrors and the same, and sometimes come together in moments of synchronicity. So I thought it was just incredible that Jung came up with that, really, and so on. So this is my embarrassing bit. But it was just so pertinent. I felt I had to tell you this. I about a week ago, I had one of the most kind of colourful and amazing dreams I've had in my life, I think, and it had various bits to it. But I ended up moving. I was having to escape. I was on a ship at sea, and I was having to escape from some people, and I could fly, and I flew upwards into the heavens, and it was incredibly colourful. And then in the dream, what happened is that I went through some sort of canopy, and then I got stuck. And in the dream, I was really upset because I was stuck, and on the other side of heaven, of this canopy, was all this beautiful blue sky. But I couldn't go into it and I couldn't go back. I was stuck in the middle of this canopy. So I woke up and I was quite upset. I was kind of, I felt really, and I wrote it down and I said, I feel unutterably sad, was what I put. And I thought, blimey, what's all this about then? And I've been really paying attention to dreams since I've been so kind of entranced by Marie-Louise von Franz. Anyway, the following day, on YouTube, there are bits of Jung, and I sort of felt like I was, bored, answering emails, and I sort of started listening to one of these YouTube bits with Jung talking. And this particular clip I'd clicked on had a number of images coming up as he was talking. They didn't have him talking. And all of a sudden, this image came up as the day after my dream, of this woman. And that's like my dream. That was my dream. Not exactly the same, but she's got her head stuck through a canopy, in the heaven. And I was just gobsmacked at the synchronicity of, I had this dream, and then I have this image. So then I emailed one of my good friends who's a classicist and said, have you seen this image before? What does it mean? And she emailed me back and said this. it depicts the philosopher piercing the veil of appearances to see the celestial mechanics and universal laws which underlie and govern the mundane, she talks like this, the mundane phenomenon of the natural world. So in other words, the dream depicts the trying to sit on the uncomfortable boundary between the ideas and the theories and the cosmologies and making it practical. And that it also, the dream and that image express the uncomfortableness of that position. It would be much easier to go and get on with it, or to go and bury myself in a theory. But I feel trapped in this kind of intermediate place. And what I found so moving about it was it's sort of like, that's my life, isn't it? That's like who I am. And it legitimates, in some sense, that sense of, that's what I'm doing, you know, and that's why I thought I had to share it with you, because it was like, this was like the week before I came here, I thought, oh, I'm going to have to tell them. So isn't that amazing? You know, it's just an amazing dream, and I really think that's why I think there's something. Marie-Louise von Franz and Jung are very convinced that the world has it's a spiritual place, whatever that means. There's more to it than meets the eye. And she was asked, you know, why are dreams so obscure? And her answer was, well, it's the best the universe can do to communicate with us, you know. What can you expect? You know, the universe is a bit bigger than us. It's trying to find a language that connects with us, which I thought was a wonderful answer. Right, so I just wanted to, just 2 more slides. I don't quite agree with this, but even Einstein said, you know, the religious feeling, if you look at just the middle bit, is the religious feeling of the scientist takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, which reveals an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection. And that is what scientists feel like. That all scientists, you know, of a particular, it's a bit like Jung was. They wrote these guys in a rather kind of superior way. You know, it's a bit superior in terms of language. But I just wanted to convey, you know, that scientists do have that sense of, you know, wow, look at all this. You know, the more I learn, the less I know. But there's something, you know, if you look at all this, if you start looking at it all, you know, wow, isn't it incredible? And Einstein actually writes about his own scientific process as muscular and visceral. He uses those words. He said, I have a muscular sense of ideas. Isn't that interesting? So, and this is what I'd like to end on. This is William James again. So his feelings of all this is I am done with great things and big plans, great institutions and big success. And I am for those tiny, invisible, loving human forces that work from individual to individual, creeping through the crannies of the world like so many soft rootlets, or like the capillary oozing of water, yet which, if given time, will rend the hardest monuments of pride. So thank you. Right then. Any questions? We've got 15 minutes for questions. Or are you all gobsmacked? Yeah.
We heard you talk about reductionism and how, like, the old science had to kind of reduce things so that they can understand it better, because it's too hard to understand the whole thing in one go. But if we view the world as complex, then how can we understand it with the same kind of thinking methods? Do we need to reduce things so that we can understand them logically, or is it? Or do we need something else?
You have to come on the course, won't you? I think it was Einstein said it's important to reduce things to as simply as you can, but not more so. So if something can't be understood by reducing it, if it's wrong, then it's not going to help. It feels right. So to give you there are certain things that have simple relationships. I'm not saying nothing can ever be understood in that way. But if you take, I'm moving on to territory that other people know more about than me. If you take that scientific method into medicine, then we get very caught up on this symptom is related to that disease, and when you go to GPs, or my experience of going to GPs recently is they want to know what your one question is, and then they go down a kind of logic chain to decide what it might be, and if you're lucky and it doesn't fit, they might go on another logic chain. But if you start saying, well, I've got this symptom, I think it connects to this, and I feel like this, and try and talk holistically about how you feel, they don't like it. And that it's not to say that understanding things in linear ways doesn't have a place, but it also loses some of that kind of holistic view of what's actually creating the problem, and it can be enormously frustrating if you don't have a cold, or a broken leg, and you have a sort of more complex systemic problem, to have that kind of reduction. But I'm not saying that simple relationships aren't sometimes useful, that we built steam engines with that kind of thinking. It's when we create it as a theory of everything, when we apply it to everything. And when you get to complex systems like economies and organisations and ecologies, and you start to say an economy can be understood by these simple relationships, you may capture an understanding of now, but you have very little understanding of how it might change into something else. So the economists go, ooh, whoops, sorry, the economy's crashed. We didn't see that coming because our models didn't understand this. We'll put these bits in our model, then we'll know next time. And if you think that way, you always think it's the same with business strategy. Ooh, whoops, sorry, we missed this bit out of our analysis. So our strategy didn't work, but now we know it, we'll put it in. There's a way in which it never works. So some of it, as we've been talking about this week, is a humility. It's an attitude to say, even if when I'm doing something simple and linear and clear, I've got to keep asking myself, what am I leaving out? What am I assuming? It might be all right for now, but do I really know this certain? Can I be this certain about how things are going to pan out? And there is something innately uncertain about the world, and we don't like that. But, wrong knowledge is wrong, isn't it? It might be clear, but it might be wrong. So.
You work with business as well, don't you?
Yes.
Have you found there's a certain tension, say, between complex systems, natural complex systems, or human-made complex systems, which evolve in time over, say, long periods of time? Complex systems going into simple patterns. That might be a long time, but if you're working in business, in our consumer-driven society, then quick profits are the order of the day a lot of the time, aren't they? To the shareholders.
Yes.
That's the sort of paradigm that we're in.
Yes.
So have you found yourself there's a tension between this time?
Yes. Well, of course, radical change isn't necessarily slow. I mean, I was, sometimes, the effect of text messaging, which is my favourite example at the moment, it's very quickly changed business and culture and the way we do things. So this is really saying there isn't a slowness about self-organising processes. But to give you an example, an organisation I'm working with works in sustainability. So this company tries to help other organisations become more sustainable and reduce their carbon footprint. So we've been developing business strategy, but the difficulty is if you try and do it rationally, what is going on? What is this government going to do? How quickly are businesses going to get it that they really have to become more energy efficient? What's the price of oil going to be? What other competition is going to emerge out of nowhere doing this same work if it gets popular? Which bits of business should we be focusing on? When we really start, to work on it, they don't have easy answers because it's all changing and emerging. So what do we do then? So we have to have a different paradigm about strategy. Instead of saying, well, we'll analyse the marketplace and we'll analyse the competition and we'll see where our strengths fit with our capabilities fit with what they do. We're doing things like saying, let's just have a meeting about what our customers are asking for. You know, so what has people been saying this week, guys? You know, about the sort of things they're asking for. Oh, so they've been asking you about behaviour change in companies, have they? You know, that it's not just about technology, it's about people's attitudes to shutting doors in buildings, you know. Oh, your customer's been asking for that as well, asking if we do that, have they? Oh, and your customer's been asking. Oh, well, that's 3 customers out of, you know, maybe we should be doing something about behaviour change in companies and add that to our strategy. Why don't we test that with a few other people and customers and some of our favourite friends? So you start to deal more, to be successful. This is still about being successful, but with the idea that you kind of feel your way into a strategy. You look for evidence, but it's more subtle than it might have been. Or another area we're going in. A couple of us happen to have some contacts in a particular area that's quite useful for what we can do. And there's nothing like a warm lead in business. You know, there's nothing like somebody who knows you. So it's become part of our strategy to go over there for no particularly more reason than I happen to know somebody who works in a big company that's going to use us. So then you start to get some expertise. Then you say, oh, well, of course, we specialise in this industry, and then off you go. So it's what a lot of entrepreneurs would generally do, but it actually makes much more sense than sometimes when you have to work with you know, British Telecom or somebody and go through this super rational, analytical model of strategy that seems only to work 20% of the time. Do you see what I mean? So, yeah.
Could I just ask who the artist was of the picture that you showed?
Well, I don't know. I was hoping somebody might tell me. I don't know. It's apparently, according to my friend, it's a 16th century woodcut. Is it? Do you know? Do you know?
I can't remember the name of the person, but it is that.
Yes.
But it's a man. I thought it was a man in the original.
Well, that was the one that was on Jung's, so it's good enough for me. That was it.
I think it's
So?
Dürer.
Was it? Oh, was it?
No, that's the wrong time.
Albrecht Dürer?
Dürer is earlier than that.
Yeah.
I think here in the room, or well, when I was in the course last week, I realised there's loads of people wanting to make change and, you know, big ambition of saving the world from climate change or other ecological disasters. If you can't strategize, really, or at least you can't strategize up to a point like, okay, I do this and that will lead to that. Been going around in my own readings a bit as well, and what I realised, well, for me that would mean, in the end, I have to have a picture of what an ideal future looks like, and then understand what the values are that underpin that, and start living those values smaller to bigger. But then, kind of understanding complexity theory, how many kind of unintended consequences can that have?
Well, and I think the thing that's the shift for me is, you know, I can have visions and I can have plans and I can have strategies, but I've got to pay more attention to how it pans out. So every step that's taken on this strategy, I then say collectively, so how are we doing then? Are we getting there? Are there any unintended consequences? So it becomes, it stops us separating strategizing and implementing. They become the same. It's an experiment. So you do your best with all the information you have. This isn't just, you know, about Zen. You know, you analyze things as well as you can. You make the best decisions you can, and then you do something, and then you say, wow, this is happening. The other thing you do is go, well, we hadn't really planned that, but, you know, hey, look, that's really taking off there. That's got lots of interest. Ooh, let's go and put some energy in here. Some companies actually kill off things that are working by mistake because they're so busy strategizing, they don't look at what's working. The other thing, I'll come to you in a minute, the other thing that I have been thinking about a lot, and it's why I think some of the interest here in new economics thinking is so vital, is there is a place for regulation in this. We're not going to get, you know, the big businesses to give up on their power by asking them nicely. And I have, there's a lot of work in complexity economics, which by Brian Arthur, which shows how the powerful get more powerful and the bigger get more bigger. The self-organising process has not got any moral value to it, and power wins out. And I can't see that we're going to, in the timescales we have, cajole people into being nice. You know, some of it is going to be at least anti-monopoly regulation. So this, people think that complexity economics is going to say, let's have a laissez-faire economy. But, you know, we've had a laissez-faire economy, thanks very much. You know, the difference between, you know, the workers and managers' salaries in the 1950s was a factor of 6. It's now over a factor of 350, and that's just in the UK. You know, goodness knows what it is in the US. So, you know, if that's laissez-faire economy, you know, we need some, I don't know what it is, and it needs to be dynamic, but we don't need to leave out the issue of regulation. So I see this, you know, in terms of like, where do I go with this? Well, some of it has to be about my values. I have to try and act as authentically as I can, and think about that, and I fail, and you know, I'm that, but I see that as is extremely important. The end can never justify the means. So, you know, I can't lie about weapons of mass destruction because I'm so sure that the thing to do is to destroy Saddam Hussein. That's not okay. I have to imagine that because I never know the consequences of my actions, all I can do is take the best next step. That's actually, there's only the present moment, you know, all that Buddhist stuff. At the same time, I think we do have to tackle big issues of infrastructure, because things like limited liability, shareholder value, are regulatory frameworks, they're laws that sit there that we kind of forget about. They are, you know, all the stuff about the nature of money, you know, interest rates. You know, we were talking about, it was usury, wasn't it? It was illegal to lend money for interest. You know, now look at us. You know, these things are hard to change, but that's what we have to do. We have to say it, we have to do it, and we all have to do it. And some people will have different roles in that than others, but it's not just about being nice, you know, or taking small steps. It is about tackling these huge issues of infrastructure and policy as well. So it's easy, really. Sorry, you were going to.
Just to bring it back down to a very simplistic level. I've worked in a very creative field, and we always would have to put my ideas forward to clients and agencies and people like that. But I became acutely aware that I ought to leave it as fluid as possible, because suddenly there is to leave a little bit of space for the invisible to become visible, because there is something else there that, you know, and you can analyse it and plan for it and do away with it completely.
Yeah.
So, you know, to allow the invisible to become visible, leave a little space for something different that isn't controlled by us.
Yeah. Well, that sounds a very good note to end on. So thank you for that. That's lovely. Thanks very much. Thank you.